Hello and welcome back. So today we are talking about some of the revolutions in the various colonies of some of the empires, and sometimes even in the cores of the empires themselves. Uh, we discuss some of the philosophy that sort of will be behind some of these revolutions, right? Particularly Locke and he's of natural rights, right? Just rights that you have in virtue of being a human. It's a pretty new idea, and it inspires, or is at least now for some of these revolutions. So the first revolution we're going to talk about is the French Revolution. So French or France in the 1700s was still the structure was still largely medieval, right? You had royalty, you had the aristocracy who owned big tracts of land, you had the peasants that worked the land, you also had merchants, in the cities and stuff. Not so different from the way it was in maybe the 1200s. But these Enlightenment ideas, right, some of which we read last week, were making some of the members of these classes a bit less content with the limitations of this system. So if you were born a peasant, there was not much chance that you would move out of your class and become a member of the aristocracy. If you remember the aristocracy, often limited by in what you do by the monarchy, by the king, and so on. So there began to be a revival of Roman and Greek notions of citizenship, which, if we can remember the back that far in the course, uh, the Athenian city-state had a form of direct democracy. Every citizen had some sort of say in the way the government ran. And you might remember there were different classes of citizenship based on property and stuff like that, but you could get rich and move up. That was sort of the key of uh, core of reforms of Solon and Cleisthenes was that they needed some kind of upward mobility, right, to keep the lower classes um, content with some people having more if they thought they had the chance to have more, right, later on. French society had been sort of calcified, and there was not the same sort of opportunities to move right from class to class. And people were getting sort of fed up with that, especially since they're looking back to the Romans and Greeks and thinking maybe that was a little better, right? Meanwhile, there were economic problems. France had been at war with all the other imperial powers and had lost nearly all of its colonies in those wars. Uh, they did still have the colony of Saint Domingue, which was very profitable. These were sugar plantations right in the Caribbean. But overall, colonies, right, they had pure colonies generating less income, which meant less income flowing in to the king, and that means raising taxes, right, on the people in France. So the aristocrats and the merchants were being squeezed for more tax revenue, and of course, nobody particularly liked paying taxes, and so they were resisting this. So this sort of led to a moment of crisis. So King Louis XVI, uh, he didn't quite have the power to just force right everyone to pay more taxes and cooperate and help sustain the empire. He needed their cooperation, and so he sort of made a big concession and convened what's called the my French is general, right? État General, the Estates General. So this was an institution that had been around for a long time, right? That was sort of nominally a form of cooperation between, the aristocracy, various classes, the clergy, the commoners, and the king. The kings had sort of become more powerful by like the 1600s and had pretty much not uh, convened right the assembly. Um, but given that King Louis XVI was uh, sort of desperate, he revived this old institution as a way to come to some sort of compromise with all various classes. But unfortunately, he once he convened right the assembly, it was clear that his power was much less than he thought, and the lower classes pretty much took over, renamed it the National Assembly, and it became the de facto government, right? And basically was lost his powers, and now the assembly was running. Uh, in addition to this National Assembly and the king sort of losing control, there was also the storming of the Bastille, right? So the Bastille was sort of a combination prison, sort of armory, right? Weapons repository, um, right? The people sort of stormed that, took a bunch of weapons, freed some prisoners. Peasants, meanwhile, were refusing to pay their landlords, so there was general uprising and chaos, at least from the point of the king, where the lower classes were seizing power, weapons as a means to more power. So the assembly was really, at this point, the only uh, body that was able to sort of control things and run things. So they became the government. The king was essentially deposed. Um, they officially abolished the nobility and enacted a land reform, right? So taking land from uh, big landowners and redistributing it. Uh, they passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which was an official declaration uh, that state was, or the power of the state was resided in the citizens, right? A kind of a form of democracy. Meanwhile, during this time of upheaval and reorganization, France came under threat of invasion from Austria and Prussia. So a lot of these King Louis XVI had a lot of friends that were monarchs in these other countries. A lot of them were related, and so um, other kings saw what was going on in France as a threat to monarchy in general, and so they threatened to invade and try to help out Louis XVI in 1791, but ended up sort of galvanizing the this new National Assembly and this new organization of government. And so they all sort of came together in the single cause of self defense. So the invasion did not succeed. Um, and this sort of made the whole movement more coherent. France was declared a republic, and there ensued a fairly severe persecution of all the people that resisted this revolution, right? And this is where the guillotine becomes a popular means of execution. So lots of aristocrats were beheaded. That was thought to be more humane than hanging, right? Because it's faster. Women were given citizenship in the new republic. They weren't given the right to vote. But this republic did not last very long. By 1799, there was a military coup, and Napoleon, who may hopefully that name is familiar to you, seized power and began to um, unravel some of the egalitarian gains of the revolution. And he eventually just formed a new empire with himself as emperor, right? But the revolution nonetheless had happened, right? It was something fairly new, very new on the scene, right? The idea of a state that was governed by the people, where people had these rights, and that idea was not going to go away, even if the republic didn't last very long. So, meanwhile, while this revolution was going on in France, there were, similar things were happening in the colonies, right? Uh, First of all, as the Republic is trying to put together, its Declaration of the Rights of Men and trying to figure out what, and when we say men, they meant humanity in general, but also there were a lot of people. Um, so all this talk about freedom and natural rights sat very uncomfortably with the actual practice of what was going on in the colonies, which was slaves, right, producing sugar. So if all the humans are born with basic rights to freedom, um, it's not clear at all that the slaves are some sort of exception. They are humans as well. So how is it? How could they be owned and forced to work? Right? It doesn't seem to sit well with their own philosophy. But on a practical level, these plantations were the backbone of the economy of France at the time. So it was hard for them to want to put that in practice and cripple, right, their. So they kind of had two options, sort of philosophically. They could uh, make up excuses, right, and modify their theories about human rights to somehow exclude Africans, right, and say, well, Europeans have natural rights, but Africans are somehow different and don't deserve rights. Some people went that route, right, um, or the hard thing and the more consistent thing to do would be actually in colonialism and in slavery. And there were people on both sides in the revolution. Diderot, a famous thinker, was against colonization, but in the end, you know, many of the people in the National Assembly were plantation owners, right? So there were common people in the assembly, but there were also aristocrats, right? So you know, the plantation owners worked hard to, exclude slaves from the new agrarian ideal. And in the end, the assembly couldn't really come to a decision on it. There were similar. Um, we don't talk. We won't be talking about the American Revolution in great detail. That's sort of a subject that typically there's entire classes on sort of American history. So we will touch on it. But I do want to say now, similar contradictions occur in the American Revolution, right? They were using uh, philosophy from Locke of natural rights to humans, but there was also a lot of slaves in the United States, right? Responsible for a lot of trade, particularly in the South. And so what they ended up doing is coming up with sort of compromises and internal contradictions of, oh yeah, we're free, but also we want to own people, right? So uh, it's a sort of internal contradiction that occurs in all of these countries. None of them really deal with it in an adequate way. Right? Years and years, and in these United States, a good century before they finally have to face the fact that you can't own humans and also claim to be a free sort of democracy where everyone has human rights. But at any rate, the Haitians didn't. In Saint Domingue is in what's now called Haiti, right? So this is the colony that France still had. Um, they got wind of what was going on, right, in the French Revolution, and they didn't wait around for the assembly to say that they're humans. They went ahead and right, took their rights by force. So they burned down plantations, assassinated the owners. Here's the Africans hanging one of the French plantation owners. So the assembly didn't want to lose the colony, right? They had recall they had sort of like dithered and weren't sure whether to declare the slaves in Haiti free. So after the slaves just decided to take power on their own, okay, now the assembly says, okay, well, I guess you're free then, and declared them to be French citizens, allowed a delegation from Haiti into assembly. All the slaves were freed officially, and then they were promptly enlisted as soldiers to help defend the colony. So, meanwhile, empires like England and Spain are watching all this and thinking, there's some unrest, there's some chaos, maybe we can swoop in and grab this colony for ourselves, right? They immediately had to enlist the newly freed uh, people in Saint-Domingue to defend the colony against other empires. So, one of the leaders of the revolt, Toussaint Louverture, um, he he became sort of the new leader of this new Haitian state, right, or this freed colony. Um, he first considered just leaving France, right, to the colony allying with Spain instead. But then, as soon as France abolished slavery, he decided, okay, we'll stick with France, right? So that was probably a good move on the part of the National Assembly, even if a little late. So he became the new leader of Saint Domingue and worked to keep the trade going, the sugar production going. Um, and you'll see sort of like, well, later when we'll talk about Marx, we'll maybe call this a case of false consciousness. When you are locked into a system, it can be hard to free your imagination enough to really think what a new system could be. And this has come, uh, we've encountered this phenomenon in the Burbank and Cooper book too, right? What they call imperial imagination, right? So uh, this new leader, right, this freed slave, uh, Louverture, he pretty much kept the similar plantation system going. Um, so in the end, folks that are working the sugar fields, right, their lifestyles didn't end up changing all that much, and so they were still dissatisfied. We're supposed to be free, but here we are doing all this backbreaking labor for little compensation, and so he faced revolt of his own. So here is a portrait of Louverture. So again, recall the French Republic, uh, as it was, didn't last all that long because Napoleon took power. And so after Napoleon took power, he had to now deal with the situation in Haiti. He tried to just turn back the clock and reinstate the old colonial system, reinstate slavery. Uh, he sent an army to Saint Domingue, and after a little bit of trickery, convinced Toussaint to surrender. And so Toussaint was then sent back to France and imprisoned and died in prisons. Uh, Napoleon did remove him from power, but the Haitians were not about to just give up, right, and go back into slavery. And so other revolutionaries, leaders took place and continued to fight. And eventually Napoleon's army gave up and left. They weren't able to uh, convert Haiti back to colonialism and slavery. So in 1804, Haiti becomes an independent state, the Republic of Haiti. Of course, the other imperial powers are watching this go on and are terrified, right? They have similar colonies, um, similar sort of ratios of like slaves to Europeans in those colonies, and it looks like if all that all that would be needed is for another colony to take a look at Haiti, get some ideas about doing that in their own area, and it wouldn't be too hard to overthrow the Europeans all over the globe. So Haiti was not recognized as an independent state by the European powers for many, many years. It took about a century before they were finally recognized as not just a threat, right, to colonial power, but as an actual state. So it's kind of clear at this point that Napoleon's a bit of a reactionary. Right? He's not thinking about equality and human rights. Turning back the clock and returning France to the good old empire that it was. Um, but there's some controversy about, was Napoleon's version of France progressive in some ways, right? Because, the revolution happened, that can't be undone, right? So that means new ideas are on the scene and we're in a new age. So people who say, oh, Napoleon was still in some way revolutionary point out that he did continue, right, the sort of dissolution of the traditional social structure. And instead of having aristocrats and nobles hanging around that just were descended from rich people, he staffed his empire with experts, people that had particular skills, particular expertise. So it was more of a meritocracy. We've seen that sort of strategy in the past with the Qin, right, and get rid of the old aristocracy and bring in people that are actually good at their jobs. Progressive in a way, but nothing new, right? This has been happening for centuries. He also created the Napoleonic Code, which was a sort of a system of laws that formalized his empire and his approach to empire, but it was in many ways guided by science and less by tradition. Right? He did create this sort of a more modern, bureaucratized state that in many ways would resemble much more what we see in the United States, where you have the country is run by people who applied for jobs on the basis of their expertise and got the jobs and are running things based on efficiency and on scientific information instead of you know tradition and religion and things like that. But all this is going on in the form of a dictatorship, right? So Napoleon is ultimately an authoritarian. So it's modern in some ways, but not exactly egalitarian. And as I mentioned, right, this strategy is particularly new for an emperor, right? That again, the Qin emperors, right, considered themselves gods on earth, but also, you know, got rid of the old aristocracy, brought in experts, and built a bureaucracy. So, Napoleon also sort of like returned a bit to feudalism, right, giving land grants to generals. We saw that other supporters, right? We saw that technique in the Byzantine Empire. So whenever you have large land grants to people that can then, get peasantry to rent the land and farm it for them, this is not a particularly progressive. So he was a successful general, right? And the empire expanded. You can see on this map, he conquered Spain, Italy, uh, had some moved into Germany, and had some allies in Scandinavia. So at its height, he ruled about 40% of the population of Europe. Part of that was, again, an old technique of, the further from the center of power some of these territories get, the more you have to take a looser hand and let them largely run things themselves, right? So, yes, he developed this centralized bureaucratic state that is in many ways modern, uh, but you can say that's mostly kind of the core of France. And then as you get towards the boundaries of his empire, uh, it's a more old-fashioned sort of feudal local aristocracy situation. So yeah, we saw. So his empire got quite large. He continued to push, and so Russia was kind of the limit of how far he could get. He tried to move into Russia and failed. Right, the Russian winter has defeated many generals. So the British and Russians were his greatest enemies. And in 1812, military expansion, he was defeated trying to move to Russia. Um, Also, some of the areas he had conquered began to rebel, um, not as like a German state, but as smaller states. So Lithuanians were beginning to break away from Napoleon's empire. Um, he died, but the empire continued. It was finally defeated by Germany, which was a reunification of Germany that had splintered in 1870. So Napoleon empire uh, came and went, like all empires. So moving on to the British, so we've seen we had an entire lecture on the British Empire, right? So England and then Britain, when unified with Scotland and Wales, was what we called a fiscal military state. So it was not a centralized sort of colonial expansion. Instead, they had various companies going out there trying to establish trade in far-flung areas of the world, from India to Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. And the England, the state, was facilitating the banking and providing a military to make sure that all this trade could happen smoothly, and collecting taxes, right? So they were quite successful, right? The sugar and slave trades were very profitable, if immoral. And then bringing in tea and textiles from India, so England was making lots of money, had a very powerful military, and particularly it's a navy, as you might imagine. You have to have a good navy in order to uh, you're looking at this kind of empire, and there's a lot of sailing going on, right? So also, meanwhile, in Britain, uh, landlords were sort of beginning to abandon the old medieval tenant farmer arrangement, right? Where you own land and then a farmer sort of rents the land from you and provides you a portion of the crops or some sort of payment. And they were beginning to move to a wage-based system, where instead of each tenant farmer being a kind of little entrepreneur, how successful depended on how favorable the terms were, to just getting a wage for working the land. What this does is now the farmers don't feel particularly tied to the land as in any way heirs or connected to them. They're no longer sort of small businessmen and they're just workers. And this is sort of the final move to make agriculture a capitalist the owner of the means of production, and then you have the wage workers carrying out the work and selling their labor, right, instead of uh, their own. It also has provided incentives for some workers, right? So feeling no longer particularly tied to the land, hoping for a better situation in the colonies, right? You can go to the Americas, you can go to North America, where the land was being um, taken from the Native Americans at cut rates, right? Either through deals that were like not exactly fair or just outright stolen, right? So you had, for Europeans at least, a fair amount of land, and you could go out there and try to make it on your own. European population in North America, right, as colonists came in and began to gain foothold and have children, the population exploded in from like hundreds of thousands into the millions. Uh, and so, of course, these people are spreading out. People went there because they wanted their own land. They didn't want to just work for a wage. And so, if you are in, you know, Virginia and there's no more land available, you're going to keep going west and west into American territory, into the territory of other empires. The French are also in North America, right? Um, the Spanish and the southern part of Florida and things like that, Texas. So uh, you're getting into war. Right? There's wars with the Native Americans. There's wars with other empires over this territory in North America. So this kept the British military uh, right involved in conflicts like the Seven Years' War, which was fought all over the globe, but it was fought in North America with the France, often hiring Native Americans as mercenaries. Meanwhile, right, these ideas floating around from John Locke about human rights and from ancient Rome about the citizenship, um, these were often the founding principles of these colonies. People were coming right to Virginia and saying we're going to start a new commonwealth based on new principles. Right? And you've got fairly adventurous um, people who are going to be coming to North America, and so uh, eventually they're not going to be crazy about the British trying to exert control, right? These colonists were the type of people that wanted more control over their government. They were forming these colonies on the basis of these sorts of principles. And so for Britain to say, no, no, you're still our colony, right? You still need to pay taxes because we're waging a bunch of expensive wars, sometimes on your behalf, colonists. Um, they weren't particularly interested in hearing that, right? They wanted to be on their own, do their own thing. They didn't feel like they needed to be these taxes to the British government. So we've got things like the Sugar Acts, the Stamp Acts, all these acts, right? The Boston Tea Party was a revolt against some sort of tax on tea and so on. So um, these are the things that sparked the American Revolution, right? You have these Americans that wanted to run their own society and not have to pay taxes. So the British tried, to fight the colonists that were seeking independence. The British tried to enlist the help of the Native Americans, but the colonists also were getting assistance from competing empires, right? So the French were helping out, the Spanish were helping out the colonists, the revolutionaries. Of course, there were loyalists as well, right? So there were some colonists that wanted to remain British. But in the end, right, the downfall of having sprawling empire is that Britain cannot retain control, right, of a bunch of determined revolutionaries on the other side of the world. You just can't keep that kind of military presence there all the time. So they couldn't really come to an agreement, right? Again, the revolutionaries in America were not going to accept any English terms. They weren't really negotiating in a way that Britain could find acceptable, find profitable. Uh, and they couldn't control them with their military, so the British cut their losses and just North American colonies. They did keep Canada. They kept the Caribbean, but this was a hit to the tax revenue that they were hoping to bring. Um, Meanwhile, right, we have all this British presence in India as well through the East India Company, and there's unrest over there as well. So the Mughals were becoming sort of dissatisfied with the creeping sort of like English presence, right? More and more, it was feeling like India was like a colony. This wasn't just a trade deal, right? But now India was feeling like a colony. So the leaders, the Mughals, were pushing back against this. There was a revolt in 1756, but they lost, right? And this gave the English uh, a reason to increase their presence, right, and increase their power in India. So the Mughals basically had to cede a great deal to give up a great deal of power to the East India Company, um, letting the East India Company basically run the government and collect taxes from the people in India. They controlled the law courts. The East India Company did. So you had right this population of India government by a company, right, whose entire purpose was to pull profit out. They weren't particularly concerned with roads and things like that, except insofar as profit. So still the East India Company would use local intermediaries to help facilitate their business, help collect taxes from the population, and so on. It became more and more um, less a trade arrangement, right, between the East India Company and the Mughals, and more like the East India Company owning and governing large parts of India. So as the East India Company became more powerful, the British government began to take notice as well, right? And sometimes would try to sort of gain control or push back or somehow prevent East India Company from becoming too corrupt and too abusive, right? You can imagine, if your government is only interested in profit, and they haven't, right? No, there's nothing in the East India Company charter about human rights, right, or anything like that. You can imagine the sort of uses of power that could go on there. So the British government was trying to uh, sort of like pull back a bit on some of these abuses. They installed new leadership in the East India Company. They pushed through some reforms, including sort of limits on the taxation of the Indian locals. Uh, Taxation was so extreme that local farmers wouldn't be able to pay, right, and would have to sell their land in order to pay taxes, and so they were just out of existence. Right? So the British government tried to come in and try to reverse some of that stuff. Um, and meanwhile, just philosophically, people in England were becoming increasingly opposed to slavery, right, and were pushing the English government to put an end to the slave trade. So there was a general sort of philosophical move toward against colonialism in general, right? Happening in the population, and there were elements of this in the United States as well. For sure, there were abolitionists, primarily in the north of northern states. Interestingly, right, this egalitarian mood didn't really extend to Ireland. Irish, for whatever reason, because they were Catholic, and again, we've seen also throughout history that the closer people are, often the more bitter the conflict. Right? Islamic caliphs could be fairly tolerant of Jews and Christians, but if you were a different sect of Islam, right, if you were Shiite and I was Sunni, tolerance among them, and it could be a similar situation here between the Protestant English and the Catholic Irish. So, Catholic Irish, they tried to revolt. The revolts were put down, and they remained an underclass for many years. So, the United States gained its independence in whatever 1776, right? And then, after some warfare after that, other English colonies remained colonies for much longer. So, Mahatma Gandhi was involved, right, in a peaceful sort of movement against the British rule. So even in the 1920s, right, the British were in charge in India, and British rule persisted in one form or another until the 40s, right? Canada gained its independence peacefully from uh, the British Empire in 1867. Jamaica remained a colony until 1962. Belize, right, until 1981. Um, Ireland is still divided, right? You have Ireland and Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is still part of the UK, right? So you have, I don't know, so you have England, right? And then England, Scotland, and Wales is Great Britain. And then England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland is the United Kingdom, right? So in a sense, Northern Ireland is still part of English Empire, and Ireland, the southern part, gained its independence in 1921 after a war. Right? So uh, we're going to talk next time. We've got some readings from Marx and Smith. Oh, is that next week? I'll have to check the syllabus. There's a few more lectures, right? Some summing up from Burbank and Cooper, and then some selections from Karl Marx and from Adam Smith. So we'll get into that in the next couple of weeks, sort of summing up, and we're kind of on the verge of what we would call a more our contemporary age, right? Where we've got the United States, right? That's familiar to us. So we're starting to see a world that's looking a little more like our world. So we're going to wrap that up in the next couple of weeks. So I'll see you then.